Hey everyone, this is Snoo. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a brand new League Start build guide, ready for patch 3.19 Lake of Calandra League, featuring 100% physical to element conversion Tornado Shot, with Soulthirst on the Deadeye Ascendancy. Tornado Shot, thought of by the community at large to be one of the best attack-based skill gems in the game, due to its scalability at high-end gearing thresholds, and rightfully so. However, at League Start on a low budget, it's generally considered only as an afterthought, due to its poor baseline damage. What if I told you there was a way to scale this ability all the way to the moon, and while doing so on a budget, with gear that should be relatively easy to acquire early in the league? Enter Soulthirst, a surprisingly common unique item, considering it packs more player power potential than even that of a Mageblood. That's right, with easy access to Souleater, one of the most powerful buffs in the entire game, the DPS potential of your character is held back only by a factor of how many monsters you can kill within the time frame of your longest lasting flask effect. Inspired Learning, one of the more expensive items on the list, is expected to be cheaper than ever before due to recent Arch-Nemesis core changes, as well as further changes designed to reduce the overall number of rare monsters in maps. For a jewel that appears to have entered in a race to the bottom, its former glory can still be harnessed in large part by any build with a capacity to simply clear fast enough to trigger the snowballing effect, granting you a wide array of impactful Arch-Nemesis buffs faster than you can lose them. This is especially true for 100% physical to element conversion builds such as this one, thanks to numerous stolen buffs granting a staggering gain 50% of physical damage as extra cold, fire, or lightning damage. For this build, the combination of these two items alone can result in periodic DPS increases of up to 100-fold, encouraging a style of gameplay that favors quick tempo, keeping momentum, all the while being strategic in managing multiple timers, giving you a real sense of achievement when you execute on all of these. Let's now take a closer look at some of the numbers in Path of Building. You can tell right off the bat that this is a life-based build with a notoriously low amount of life for a Deadeye. Nothing unusual about that. Yet one glance at the effective hit pool and it becomes obvious this is no glass cannon after all. This build has more defensive layers than most, some of which are quite unusual, including a small but not completely insignificant amount of armor, a healthy chance to evade attacks, capped spell suppression almost entirely on account of the passive skill tree thanks to the recent buffs of course, highly dependable endurance charges with a much better than average Immortal Call uptime, and lastly, Windward, a black sheep of an ascendancy point that proves itself to be worthy in the face of nearly unlimited attack speeds. But all of this pales in comparison to the defensive potential granted by stealing Arch-Nemesis buffs. Inspired Learning will ultimately be the defense MVP, despite receiving no recognition for it in the PoE configuration. The recovery is great too, with a bit of life in Mana Leech, a level 20 vitality gem, and most notably, plus 15 life on hit that feels more like 150 life on hit at times, thanks again to having nearly unlimited attack speeds. On the topic of recovery, notice there's almost no unreserved mana, but that's okay, because Tornado Shot will either be free or nearly free of cost at pretty much all times. Some of the other more expensive abilities will be linked to a life tap support gem to remove any threat of being unable to cast on account of having not enough mana. If, for some reason, you're still struggling with the mana pool, you can always lower your vitality gem a level or two, or better yet, find yourself an unnatural instinct. Survival instincts, with the corruption shown here. You might be surprised at how easy it will be to get your hands on one of these at League Start. As you can see, the full damage found on this setup is a humbling 1.1 million DPS, but that does not paint the full picture. Take a look at the configuration tab. Every conceivable in-combat buff seems to be present, save for one. The most important one. Number of Souleater stacks. Observe in glorious glee as the sheet DPS outright doubles at roughly every 50 stacks gained. Now, try not to lose yourself as you witness just how fast these stacks can be accumulated while doing juiced content. With your flasks lasting upwards of a minute straight, hopefully you can see just how much DPS scaling potential this belt has to offer. Let's move on to the passive skill tree. It comes fully equipped with a leveling breakdown viable for either Tornado Shot or Lightning Arrow as an arguably superior alternative. Rest assured, Tornado Shot will get the job done, and it'll give you some much needed practice if you've never used it before, as it can come off a bit clunky to a first-time user. At some point, you may find yourself shy of meeting certain attribute requirements, in which case you can invest in one or more of the accessible strength and/or intelligence notables nearby. Once you pick up Trinity support, You will need to keep an eye on your elemental damage spread to ensure you are unlocking all 3 resonance types while in combat. The notes section contains more useful information and may be updated upon receiving valuable feedback regarding any major player issues found within the build. Much of the inspiration for the leveling portion of this guide came from Havoc, a well-renowned PoE campaign speedrunner. Feel free to check the description for a link to one of Havoc's Acts 1 through 10 speedrun featuring Tornado Shot to gain a deeper understanding on how to level most efficiently with this skill. The final tab features a character leveled to 91 with all campaign quests unlocked and with a gear set ready to take on some of the hardest mapping content this game has to offer, including T16 Legion bosses inside a Delirium mirror. For the record, all of the footage showcased in this video is of this exact character whose POV was used as the blueprint for the making of this build guide. Let's examine the skill tree more closely as we segue into better understanding the mechanics of this build. Because we're using Soulthirst, it's borderline mandatory that we take all the increased flask duration nodes available on the tree. This includes Druidic Rite, Natural Remedies, and a few small nodes for a total of plus 65% increased duration of flask effect. Of course, this does not count the Survival Instincts jewel we conveniently carried over from the campaign, as well as 2 6 passive medium cluster jewels we'll want for even more duration and other useful stat rolls. Flask effect as a modifier is also very useful and worthy of 1 mastery point. One of the often overlooked aspects of a Soulthirst build is its ability to transition across the map quickly and freely, prioritizing higher combat engagement and therefore better overall clear times. Phasing will already be covered by our decision to use a quartz flask, and movement speed will naturally come from the Quicksilver flask in a major way. Additionally, there are multiple sources of increased movement speed that can be found scattered all about the ranger portion of the tree, including notables like Quickstep, Fleetfoot, and its corresponding mastery point. Graceful Assault will also indirectly increase our movement speed by improving the effectiveness of Onslaught, as well as giving Onslaught itself some much needed improved uptime. This will result in a grand total of plus 325% increased movement speed when all buffs come together. Spell Suppression is still an incredibly powerful defensive layer and privy to the Ranger class now more so than ever before. We'll be picking up enough sources to hit cap in conjunction with having a series step equipped. The Inveterate Wheel by itself now gives a whopping 39% spell suppression, not counting the mastery. Quickstep and Intuition add a bit more. The Quartz Flask, which was already chosen for phasing, also gives a cool 13% spell suppression after increased flask effect modifiers are taken into account. If for some reason you're still not suppress capped from all of these sources, you can get 12% more by simply swapping the spell suppression mastery over. It's all too easy. While Darosso's Defiance will be responsible for giving us endurance charges, frenzy charges will come from a mastery point in the Marked for Death wheel. Incidentally, the Culling Strike against marked enemy is a very good notable in its own right. Unfortunately, there is no convenient way to get power charges into this build, but occasionally you'll get them anyway, on account of stealing Arch Nemesis buffs. Charisma, in conjunction with Sovereignty anointed on the amulet, as well as help from a few reservation masteries, will unlock 2 major auras, a Herald, Defiance Banner, and a maxed out Vitality Gem, with very little mana to spare. So be on the lookout for a helmet with this implicit to give yourself some much needed breathing room if you wish to have it, or you can always settle for the corrupted survival instincts mentioned before. Although neither of these should really be necessary. The remaining passive points are taken as a means to increase our damage and health in a most cost-effective way. Point Blank is the only keystone we'll want because of the flexibility of how Tornado Shot functions as a mechanic. It has the unique ability to shotgun at melee range, layering multiple arrows into the target location at once, making it surprisingly good at single target damage scaling. Moving on to core skills and mechanics, let's begin with the gems. Tornado Shot will be our primary attack. It starts with a single arrow fired directionally at your cursor pointer. Then it splits into 3 additional projectiles, shooting in any direction, or 4 with the preferred helmet enchant. Upon hitting an enemy, those same 3 or 4 projectiles will then fork into 2 additional projectiles, thanks to us using a fork support gem. After that, because of the ascendancy point, Ricochet, each remaining active projectile will have the opportunity to chain one last time into an enemy it had not yet hit in its long journey. In total, with this setup, 1 arrow can produce up to 16 successful attack hits, which goes to show just how insanely strong adding additional projectiles can be. Endless Munitions is the primary reason why the Deadeye Ascendancy is chosen for this build. On a side note, greater multiple projectile support is a worthy contender despite its awful downside. However, it gets completely outclassed the moment your Inspired Learning kicks in and the Stolen Arch Nemesis buff count begins to rise, assuming you're already at the physical to element conversion stage of the build. This is why we will ultimately be upgrading to Anomalous Tornado Shot, making 60% of our physical damage convert to a random element, which in turn guarantees Trinity support 100% functionality. The remaining 40% can be acquired conveniently from the Cold Mastery on the passive skill tree, making Freeze and Chill our highest performing elemental ailment, improving our defensive layers even more. Alternatively, a Watcher's Eye with the appropriate Hatred modifier can be used as a substitute, saving up to 4 passive points in the process. It should be noted, Brittle is neither necessary nor recommended for this build. Elemental damage with attack support and vicious projectile support will be used solely for the purpose of increasing the primary skill's damage as much as possible. Inspiration support is nice for the extra damage too, but more importantly, the significant reduction in mana cost for each primary attack. This function alone proves to be invaluable on a build that can easily reach 10 or more attacks per second. With combat buffs, the final cost of Tornado Shot should generally be 0. Tornado Shot will also be featured in a focused Ballista Totem setup for some added damage, and with even greater emphasis put on chilling and freezing enemies via an added cold damage support. Auras will play a significant role in the build. We will be fitting in Hatred, a huge damage boost for any build featuring physical to cold conversion. Grace, helping us to avoid attacks and in turn keeping our endurance charge and gale force count uptime high while mapping. Defiance Banner, greatly reducing the threat of monster critical strikes, while also giving a small increase to armor and evasion. Vitality, as perhaps our only source of life regeneration, providing great quality of life against all forms of damage over time, especially those derived from after-death effects. And lastly, a Herald of your choice. Herald of Purity is technically the highest DPS option and grants minions on kill that serve as a means to keep enemies preoccupied from targeting you. Herald of Ice, which you will have been using the whole time, still packs quite the punch in terms of on-death AoE damage and freezing effects. And Herald of Ash, an odd choice on its face, but comes equipped with a healthy chunk of gain physical damage as extra fire damage, and its own on-death effect that offers some nice quality of life towards maintaining maximum rampage stacks in maps. Plus, it's so much fun when combined with a build-enhanced Gloom Shrine. Seriously, T16 Legions won't stand a chance. Dash will be our movement skill of choice, but without an alternate quality, there's no major advantage to choosing this one over any of the others. Sniper's Mark takes up 1 curse slot and is truly the best option in that regard. It gives major benefits both for single target and for clearing. Hilariously, the loss of life and mana flask charges gained due to the recent nerfs has literally no impact on this build. Mark on Hit is a support gem that periodically triggers a linked mark when hitting dangerous enemies with any attack, which means we won't even have to think about it. The only drawback is the increased mana cost, which we can't afford because we are reserving almost 100% of our mana. Therefore, a life tap support gem is aptly included for both Dash and Sniper's Mark, but that won't be the only link using a life tap support. Another will be needed for our Immortal Call, which should be on left click as opposed to the all too common cast when damage taken support link. The potency of our Immortal Call is increased dramatically by both an increased duration support as well as the endurance charges that come flooding in thanks to Darius's Defiance. Expect an almost 50% uptime on Immortal Call that will make you nearly immune to all incoming physical damage. It's time to talk about the gear. Darius's Defiance, which was just mentioned a moment ago, is a highly underrated, unique body armor that can almost rival even the very best influenced armor crafts point for point, especially when paired with Immortal Call and Worm Sign, creating a very interesting dynamic around rapid endurance charge acquisition. It comes with a huge armor and evasion hybrid roll, a decent amount of life, and effectively 20% increased movement speed and attack speed while in combat. Worm Sign also gives a solid life roll and the means to somewhat dependably reduce your Tornado Shot's mana cost from 4 all the way down to 0, which is actually perfect considering how maximum inspiration charge uptime works. But most importantly, this pair of gloves gives Rampage, a highly impactful mechanic for any player good at keeping the momentum high while mapping. At a maxed 1000 kill streak, this buff gives a walloping 200% increased damage and 50% increased movement speed. Furthermore, these gloves are not a very popular item and are exceedingly common, so much so that with a bit of luck, you might be able to find a pair with the elemental weakness on hit implicit, shown here without having to invest much currency at all. As a disclaimer, using these gloves with the Val implicit will be counterproductive to the build, sabotaging the effectiveness of your sniper's mark. Unless you can pair it with another Val implicit, you can apply an additional curse found only on amulets, which is why our amulet of choice will be an even cheaper and more easily obtainable unique item, Karui's Ward. Straight out of Act 1, there will be an outrageous supply of these amulets on the market on the first couple days of the League. Even for a rare corruption like this one, the sheer number of amulets in circulation should result in a few of these being up for grabs at League start. A serious step. This very easy to solo farm unique is a popular choice for boots at League start due to its high spell suppression roll. Keep in mind, it may be more expensive than in past leagues due to the recent broad scale nerfs on spell suppression found on gear. The Gull is a love it or hate it unique that brings enormous player power in a variety of ways when synergized with the corresponding shrine passives on the Atlas passive tree, at the cost of you, as a player, having to be kind of good at clicking. For 3.19, we unfortunately lost domination on the Kirt crafting bench, which guaranteed 4 additional shrines on each map, but you can still guarantee 124 seconds of glorious Gloom Shrine shenanigans on every map, with the cost of a sextant slot. The Taming is a long-forgotten unique that fits in surprisingly well with our build. It's one of the more expensive items on the list, but certainly won't break the bank. With a few cheap catalysts, you're looking at 136% increased elemental damage in most situations, alongside up to 40% increase to all elemental resistances. Despite having so few stats, you can't argue with those numbers. We'll be using Lioneye's Glare for our weapon of choice. This bow shares a divination card with Lioneye's Fall, a popular League start jewel that we're not interested in, which means lots of players will be turning in this divination card in hopes of getting a Lioneye's Fall, but instead often getting a Lioneye's Glare, which they don't want. That puts us in a great position for acquiring this bow with decent rolls. On the surface, this item doesn't appear all that impressive, yet it's one of the highest physical DPS unique bows in the game, and it has a very fast local attack speed. But what makes it truly special is its unique modifiers. Hits can't be evaded. Means not only do we not need to run precision, but we can ignore all accuracy on gear and on the skill tree in favor of other stats. And we'll never have to worry about leveling our way out of the hit cap. As good as that sounds, it's nothing compared to getting a straight up free ascendancy point, and a good one too. Normally this build wouldn't take Far Shot because Ricochet offers more useful functionality in maps. Far Shot makes you do a little less damage at short range, scaling up to a lot more damage at long range. This is quite literally the opposite of what Point Blank does. So why are we using both? The answer can be found in this graph, which was pulled straight from the PoEDB website, and will be linked as a resource in the video's description. The red line represents Point Blank, and the green line, Far Shot. The purple line is what happens when you take both at the same time. It turns out their upsides are numerically higher than their downsides, resulting in more damage at any given range, roughly 20% more by the looks of it. You will need to 6-link either your bow or your body armor to meet the threshold of player power present in this build. As you can see, most of the gear is comprised of relatively cheap early game uniques that don't hinge very much on the quality of their rolls. Obviously, not every item slot is best served by a unique. You'll have to clear the rest of your resistances and attribute requirements from your quiver, 1 ring, and 2 6 passive medium cluster jewels. It may not seem like a lot of room to work with, but just take a look at the items on this character. They leave much to be desired. Definitely the kind of gear you could expect to get your hands on in the first couple days of the league. Bow attacks fire an additional arrow is a mandatory modifier on the quiver slot, and the sole reason why a unique quiver simply won't suffice. Fortunately for us, attack-based bow builds are not very popular league starters, which means a ton of decently rolled quivers should be floating around in circulation early on. Isolate quivers with the aforementioned roll and find yourself a good one at a satisfactory price. For those of you who still prefer to craft gear over trading for gear, Harvest Reforged Rare attacks more common, and serrated fossils are a decent choice. As for the ring, this is a great opportunity to focus on attributes. Crafting is more likely to be a viable option here. Deafening Essence of Rage is your best bet. Look for a decent intelligence and or life roll with it. Benchcraft the one missing, and call it a day. You'll undoubtedly be working on the cluster jewels last, so don't sweat it if you're still underwater attribute-wise. The 25% increased effect of modifiers is nice, but not mandatory, especially if you're still lacking in other useful stats. Aside from meeting the necessary attribute requirements and hitting capped all elemental resistances, which includes flasks, you'll want to focus the remainder of your rare rolls on maximum life, chaos resistance, and damage. If you can manage to cap your elemental resistances, meet the necessary gear and gem attribute requirements, hit 1 million DPS on the sheet, while clearing 3k life and escaping negative chaos resistance, you've done well. The only piece of gear left is Soulthirst, the linchpin of this entire build, so let's talk about how to use it effectively in the next section of the guide. One of the biggest reasons Soulthirst builds are not generally popular is because they require the player to let go of one of the biggest tropes in the ARPG genre, life and/or mana flask recovery. There will be none of that here. To use this build effectively, you won't have the luxury of incorporating in a life or mana flask. But that's just the thing, you won't have to. The mana flask problem is solved by simply bringing the resource cost of your primary attack all the way down to 0. The life flask problem is solved by powering through incoming damage on account of triple dipping in life recovery via regeneration, leech, and most notably, life on hit. Still, at some point in maps, you will undoubtedly find your health pool dropping precipitously to the point of actual death. Unfortunately, using flasks in response to your surroundings is not conducive to this build. Every build has its weakness. This is just something you'll have to get used to. The Souleater buff grants 5% increased attack speed and cast speed per stack, and there is no limit on how many stacks you can get. It's only a matter of time. Your flask effect duration determines that amount of time. With the Soulthirst belt equipped, when you have no flasks active, your next flask will trigger the Souleater buff, and the duration of that buff will be snapshotted into the flask triggering it. It cannot be triggered again until its original source has expired, either by running out or by re-triggering that flask ahead of time. Any other flasks used within this time frame will not cancel the Souleater buff, but merely reset the stack count. What that means is you want to trigger the Souleater buff with your longest lasting flask, then use your other 4 flasks immediately thereafter so you can receive their buffs quickly before having made any progress regarding Souleater stacks. The next time you use a flask, it should be the original flask that started the whole process. This all-important, longest-lasting flask is the only one whose inherent buffs will depend on. And for that, we're choosing the Bismuth flask, helping us cap our elemental resistances and reducing the mana cost of our skills by a substantial amount. These are 2 very powerful buffs that we can count on in ways we won't be able to for the other flasks. Best bet is to purchase an item level 84 plus base and alt spam until you get a good experimenter prefix roll. Then benchcraft the Veiled Suffix modifier. In order to unlock this Veiled Suffix modifier, you'll likely have to purchase pre-veiled Cinder Swallows and successfully unveil the modifier yourself. Or better yet, have a trustworthy companion simply put it on for you. The remaining 4 flasks are also rather long-lasting utility flasks, with roughly 80% uptime, each serving a valuable purpose at the critical moments before we hit insane power spikes. First, the Unique Flask, Taste of Hate, a tremendously powerful flask both defensively and offensively for physical cold conversion builds. Second, a Jade Flask for added evasion and a significant increase to the chance to inflict elemental ailments. Third, a Quartz Flask, which has been mentioned twice already for its spell suppression and phasing, but also majorly reduces the effect of curses on you. And finally, the beloved Quicksilver Flask, who only ever asks to go a little bit faster. You may wish to select different flasks or different suffix modifiers for your Soulthirst build, but just keep in mind, everything you see here is the result of countless hours playtesting this build, and not just for the sake of making a build guide. You will always be at your most vulnerable state upon entering a map well before having made enough kills to initiate the snowballing effect. It's at this time you will need to be on your most defensive footing, but being defensive comes with its own set of issues. Given that we're a ranged build, it's imperative I mention the range of the Souleater buff. Not every single monster you kill will automatically increase your Souleater count, not because there's any kind of internal cooldown, but because its range is hard capped at 60 units, which is roughly half a screen in width. Meaning, Soulthirst, as an item, is seemingly tailor-made for melee builds, but we're not running a melee build, because melee is dead, says everyone always. So, if we wish to take the most advantage of this absurdly powerful mechanic, we'll have to employ a more aggressive playstyle, running deeper into the kill zone before firing away. Be careful though, as in doing so you may bite off more than you can chew. Striking a delicate balance between knowing when to push your luck versus when it's best to pull back is something of a dance, and it'll likely take you lots of practice to get down pat. Or you could just run strongboxes on every map and force the game to give you exactly what you want with almost none of the risks usually involved. Yeah, it's kind of broken. In all seriousness, any situation involving you being completely surrounded by monsters while not feeling all that threatened by it is precisely the situation you want to find yourself in. And guess what? You have a lot of agency in this as well, because at the end of the day, there is no better way to consistently reach a high Souleater count than to merely stuff as many monsters into the map as possible. So, if you are looking for a low-budget build that can not only do high-tier mega-juiced content, but capitalizes on it in a stupid kind of way, then you're looking exactly in the right place. Every map ran as footage for this video was 8-mod corrupted using the following scarabs and sextants, while selecting Fortune Favors the Brave in conjunction with Shaping of the Valleys, on an Atlas passive skill tree spec'd into all of the increased effective modifiers small nodes, while specifically targeting Shrines, Strongboxes, Breach, Legion, Deli Mirrors, and the Eater of World Influence. That's a hell of a lot of juice being forced into each map, especially given that it doesn't even feature Beyond. One of the most important questions about a build like this is how does it perform when bossing? Short answer, it doesn't. Long answer, as you can see from the footage, the build can handle a map boss with total ease. But do not be deceived. This is entirely on account of generating obscene power spikes inside the map and then bringing all of that into the arena. So just to drive the point home, here's some footage of the same boss fight you've seen multiple times now on the exact same character, but without any of that power that only comes from clearing the map first. As you can see, it looks like a totally different build. Suddenly, nowhere near as overpowered as it seemed just moments ago. And that's the catch. We put all of our chips in one basket. This is a mapping build, through and through. When it comes to killing the necessary bosses and invitations to fully unlock your Atlas, you will find the process quite strenuous. My advice is not to push your luck. Purchase the carry. Feel good knowing you'll make the currency back in spades with all that time you saved, spending more time in maps, which is exactly where you belong. Despite this being a unique heavy build, most if not all of the items featured in the PoE for this build do not require great rolls, and therefore should be easily obtainable on a low budget, putting you in good standing for beginning the pursuit towards your next major upgrade, like Omniscience, a Headhunter, a Mirror Tier Bow, or potentially a second character altogether. That said, a few minor upgrades along the way are advisable given their favorable cost-to-benefit ratio, including, but not limited to, Awakened Elemental Damage with Attack Support, granting outright immunity to Elemental Reflect at level 5, unlocking the truest quality of life, known as no longer having to read map modifiers. Awakened Fork Support, making your arrows fork not once, but twice, even at just level 1. Divergent Dash, granting phasing for 2 seconds after dashing, which should come in handy when your Quartz Flask is inevitably down. Upgrading the quality of your Bismuth Flask to 28% via Hillock's crafting bench in the Mastermind's lair. The best helmet enchant, Tornado Shot, fires an additional secondary projectile. Will certainly not be easy to acquire, but it's worth considering nonetheless, given that it'll result in roughly 25% more damage across the board, regardless of your current gear threshold. Lastly, converging your 2 separate medium cluster jewels into one 8 passive Boyer large cluster jewel is never a bad idea. One last reminder, every bit of footage shown in this video was an exact representation of the gear and the spec found in the path of building linked in the description below. Just keep in mind, a famous person once said, "It's not the plane, it's the pilot." This build is dedicated to the kind of player who would revel in such a quote. It goes without saying, results may vary depending on the user as well as the user's specs. If you're setting out to follow this build in 3.19, then good luck. In the event future changes to the game take place that negatively impact the performance of this build on a minor level, expect an update addressing these changes in the description of the video. Should such changes become great enough, effectively rendering the build unviable, then expect the video to be taken down, only to be replaced by a hopefully superior build guide. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments section. Subscribe to this channel or become a Patreon supporter if you would like to support the channel and see more related PoE content. Whether you decide to take on this build or not, I sincerely hope this video was of some benefit to you. Thank you for watching, and good luck out there in Rayclast.